We will make available a Q&A session at the end. So if you have any questions, please hold them till then. You are welcome to as well, if you are fearful that you will forget what that question is, to pop it in the chat box as well. And we will get to that question when we come to the Q&A portion of this discussion. What will happen is I'm just going to give a very brief overview of why we are here, the PPFA and party funding in general. Then I will pass to my colleague Nisha and then to Busi. So once again, thank you to all of you for being here today. And this is really a historic and auspicious occasion for us, for the speakers here on the panel today, for those of you who have joined us in watching this, and for those of you who are part of media as well. You will know that for a very long time, for many years, in fact, that many civil society organizations, activists, and various campaigns have for many years been campaigning around the issue of party funding. And crucial to this was the point that what we want to see happen is a transparent and accountable political space. We have had many examples in history. I think most recently, and perhaps uppermost in everybody's mind, some of the revelations that have come out of the Zondo Commission into state capture, where we have seen what the actions of our politicians and elected officials can have on the lives of ordinary, everyday South Africans. And part of that issue that we have seen there is that when private money, elite individuals have access to those people endowed with the power to enact political decisions on our behalf, sometimes they don't act in the public good, in the public interest. And we have this situation where private money, private interests essentially trump those public interests and the public good. And so for a very long time, we have been advocating and working in the space where we wanted a piece of legislation, where we wanted something that concretized the ideas of transparency and accountability in our political space. And as I'm sure many of you know, what came out of that was the Political Party Funding Act, which on the 1st of April this year was enacted. So now we have a piece of legislation which puts a lot of responsibility on our political parties to be open and honest about what kind of funding they are receiving and what the actual amounts are of that funding. And obviously the thinking behind this act is that we can close off those opportunities for corruption and opportunists to really come in and run away with our political parties, where we, the people, suffer under those decisions that are not taken in our best interests. So this is really the impetus behind the Coalition on Party Funding. We first of all recognize the importance of the Political Party Funding Act, but we also recognize that what we are up against is a political culture that perhaps is not putting the interests of the public uppermost when these kind of decisions are being made. And so we would like to engender a kind of political culture that always works in the interest of the people, especially when legislation does not exist to dictate that kind of behavior, or if we do have that legislation where those spaces are for open interpretation, then what it will come down to is actually always moving in the interest of the people, and obviously in that space of accountability and transparency. So before I go any further, and hopefully not on a tangent, I'm going to pass over to my colleague Nisha Patel of the Amplifying Foundation for some of his inputs on this. Nisha?
Thank you so much, and greetings to everybody. Indeed, this is a historic coming together, and potentially a huge game changer in the kind of politics of this country. I just want to make a couple of points, and some of it also just to reflect on my own work dealing with elections. But to start off with, I think the context is one that 2019 saw, for the first time possibly ever, where my vote didn't count. Many other votes didn't count, where more people who were eligible to vote and participate in the 2019 elections didn't, compared to the actual number who did vote. And this is important for us to begin to understand why. It does indicate a huge trust deficit that has now grown to the point where people have abstained from voting or even registering to vote. It has raised fundamentally the credibility issues of government, confidence in it. But most importantly, the element of hope, which was so prevalent from 1994 onwards, has disappeared fundamentally for vast sections of people in this country who would have trusted in the political system. Now, when that begins to break down, all kinds of other power structures begins to replace the formal political structures that people would normally have faith and trust in. But all of this is not the creations of, it didn't come about only from 1994. And I just want to share just some of this. In the 80s and early 90s, out in the south of Joburg, you had what was called the Lenasia Southeast Management Committee. These so-called puppet structures, in their efforts to argue against that kind of label, convinced the Transvaal provincial administration at the time to allow them to do their own procurement. And as soon as they were given that procurement, the very first thing that they did was to then create companies amongst themselves and to then be awarded tenders that well, I don't even know if you can call it tenders, but they became the service providers as well as the decision makers. And that kind of behavior and culture, I think, would have been prevalent across all government structures at the time. So by the time you get to 1994, this kind of behavior and culture is deeply entrenched and gets carried over in a very significant way, and I would dare say then gets refined as we move closer to where we are today. I managed the ANC elections campaign in Lenasia in 1994. A lot of the funding for that campaign was really from donations, primarily from small businesses and self-fundraising efforts, from cake sales to everything else. But as soon as the elections were over and we got into local government, many of the donors, or I wouldn't say many, some of the donors there began to ask why they should tender for any of the services that municipality required when they didn't have to tender to give the local ANC branch their support when it was asked for. And we started to already begin to see a very different mindset that was a carryover from the past, but also one that didn't understand the new rules of the game. I managed the Gauteng elections for the ANC in 95 and 99. And those elections cost 5 million in total for this province. Today, those elections would probably cost, or they would have spent somewhere between 200 million, if not more. And in the period of 99, with Mbazima Shilowa as the kind of key character or leader of that campaign, a lot of this money was from donations, but also significant local branch fundraising activities, raffles and cake sales and all kinds of stuff. I would dare say that that kind of culture has but disappeared. The one key distinction is that donations in 99 was actually sought from companies who were awarded government tenders, but those donations were sought after the tenders were in fact had been awarded and all the paperwork done. Later, I think the culture has changed, where donations are actually solicited prior to any tender being given. And in fact, guarantees comes with that kind of stuff. Now, all of that, I think, is what flows into where we are today. Once those kinds of loopholes, coupled with the empowerment issues that started to emanate from 1999 onwards, I think opened up huge avenues for the abuse of this system. So this legislation, I think, is incredibly important. But there is a flip side to it that we perhaps need to also start thinking about, which is really the expenditure side of government and how that begins to get monitored. Quotations, tenders, and everything else. If you take the city of Joburg, I think it's 60 billion rands worth of expenditure in the last financial year. Now that is just huge amounts of money. You've seen the EOH reports, you've seen the testimony of the former mayor at the Zondo Commission, and a huge amounts of questions there in terms of the money flows that comes through. So as much as I think the usage of this kind of monitoring in terms of party funding is going to be important, we also have to start developing civil society capacity to look at the financial reports of all kinds of government entities and to draw the links between the funding and the kind of tenders that get awarded. Because if we don't link them up, I think we're going to be missing a huge element here. But as I conclude, we must also be ready that there will be a fight back to this legislation. Parties will begin to look at indirect funding methods, off-book funding methods. There's already hints that they would want legislation changed or softened, or increasing thresholds for reporting. And there's huge talk about increasing government funding for political parties themselves. So we have a huge job to firstly get compliance with this current legislation, to begin to make the best use of that legislation. And the one recommendation that I think as a coalition we need to look at is, as the first set of reports gets published, perhaps we need to start recognizing the best party political funding report and indicate why we think that is good and set that as the benchmark for others to follow. So I thought it's just important not to just talk about this in an abstract way. I've seen how funding can manipulate, I think, political structures and how they can be invaded, both as an elections manager, but also as a public servant. And this kind of work today, I think, begins to address one of the many shortcomings within our political system. So the foundation is very happy to be associated with this coalition and the work that will begin to flow from here. And I think it can only but help to strengthen our democracy at a time when I think it is under such severe threat from all kinds of quarters that any work that strengthens it, I think should be welcomed by everybody. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Nisha. And those words, I think, quite searing, and you are absolutely right. We are not trying to work simply in the theoretical or the abstract. We're trying to make real world and real life changes here. And I think what's of particular importance is showing here, which is, I think, a big part of our work, that the conversations around party funding is not an abstract thing. It has a real life consequence for the way in which we live our lives. But before I go any further, Busi from Right to Know.
Thank you, Robin. Good morning, everyone. Well, firstly, I'm just going to start with why Right to Know is part of this coalition and why we find it important in the work that we do as the campaign. For us, we believe that voters have the right to know where political parties get their money. So that's why we've been supporting the struggle for transparency on political party funding. Because without knowing the financial backers of major political parties, voters are kind of kept in the dark about potential conflicts of interest, and had no way of knowing who may be influencing the policies and activities of these various parties. We believe that in terms of when you look on the party funding, that vast majority of funding comes from private sources, and sadly not a single political party was, or I can still say is, willing to say who its funders are. And of course, the current climate, in the current climate, we see that corporations, wealthy individuals, as we have seen with the Guptas, and sometimes even foreign governments can buy influence and favors from political parties across the aisles, as we have witnessed through the state capture. And there have been a lot of funding scandals and reports across the country. We know about the ANC, and sadly, the ruling party is not only the party that is tainted when it comes to the issue of party funding. In 2015, the Amapungane Center for Investigative Journalism reported on allegations that the DA-governed city of Cape Town had overlooked its own bylaws to approve the building plans of a political donor, as well as rumors that private developers, possibly they could have been DA donors, were behind the then Mayor Patricia de Lille's decision to back a controversial 1 billion development on the Clifton coastline. So we see that the road runs deep. And of course, lack of transparency and regulation on private donations to political parties created a climate of secrecy and political inequalities, which allowed corruption to thrive and kind of eroded public faith in the electoral system and undermined the values of our constitution. So for us as the Right to Know campaign, we are happy to be part of the coalition because we strongly believe that people of South Africa have a right to know who's bankrolling the political parties and candidates that seek their votes, and how those funds are spent. So in general, we believe that the time to hold politicians to account is now. Hence, we are part of this coalition. Thank you. And now I'm gonna read the statement, our coalition statement in related to this particular launch. Recent history in South Africa has laid bare how money and narrow interest have captured the state, influenced our politics, derailed service delivery, weakened our institutions, and threatened our democracy. We have recently faced one of the greatest moments of upheaval in our country since the dawn of democracy. The protests in Gauteng and KwaZulu-Natal have exposed the extent to which looting of state resources can deeply affect the lives of ordinary people. It is the people and communities living in townships and rural areas facing widespread unemployment and little or no access to basic services such as food, water, and housing. They have paid the biggest price. Even as the COVID-19 pandemic continues to ravage communities across all provinces, corruption and malfeasance have continued relentlessly, limiting our ability to provide an effective response to this and, of course, future crises. In this context, and after more than 2 years of campaigning by civil society, the country celebrated the enactment of the Political Party Funding Act on April 1st, 2021, which ushered in a new era in our democracy. The Act creates a much needed transparency framework that aims to ensure that political parties disclose information about who funds them. The Act also provides for the establishment and management of a public and private fund while prohibiting donations to parties by foreign governments or agencies, foreign persons or entities, organs of state or state-owned enterprises. In addition, it makes provision for the regulation on disclosure of accepted donations and assigns powers and duties to the Independent Electoral Commission to administer and manage funds. The creation of a coalition of civil society organizations and activists supported by the works of journalists has been prompted by an interest and commitment to deepening our democracy and holding leaders of political parties to account. The purpose of the coalition on party funding is to advocate for a transparent and accountable political funding space through collective action. This is to deter corruption and inept governments that has historically been shown to be a consequence of unregulated private money in politics. The coalition's purpose is to demand accountability and take steps to ensure it. The coalition will focus on ensuring that political party funding regulatory framework created by the Act will facilitate the transparency and accountability that it promises. The coalition will work alongside the Act to engender political practices that work in the best interest of all in South Africa. The coalition launched today recognizes that political parties are essential vehicles through which people can participate in our democracy, and that effective implementation of the Act will deter government corruption, enhance transparency and accountability, and ultimately contribute to a stronger and more robust democratic order. Ahead of the first set of party funding disclosures by political parties under the Act, the proposed local government elections, the first task of the coalition is to focus its campaigning on ensuring that the Act is implemented effectively, does what it purports to do, and supports the IEC in its mandate to administer the Act, ensuring that they are adequately capacitated. The coalition pledges to work collectively to monitor and evaluate compliance with the funding disclosure process, make information on who funds and influences political parties more accessible to the public, provide voters with information to help make informed voting decisions, advocate around the limitations in the existing PPFA legislation that hamper its ability to ensure that political parties are transparent and accountable. And lastly, work towards changing our political space so that it is not influenced by money and narrow interest, but it is owned by all. The coalition calls on all other members of civil society organizations, academia, the media, and the public to closely follow the upcoming disclosures and to advocate for full transparency in the process. We invite interested parties to join the coalition in pushing for the effective implementation of the Act as a matter of primary importance in our democracy and of significant public interest. It is time for transparency in our political systems and accountable mechanisms that provide voters with information. The coalition provides another tool to hold political parties to account, expose corruption and undue political influence when it occurs. This statement is endorsed by 7 organizations. We have the Ahmed Kathrada Foundation, we have Corruption Watch, Helen Suzman Foundation, My Vote Counts, Parliamentary Monitoring Group, Nifuna Ukwazi, and the Right to Know campaign. Thanks, Robin.
Thank you very much, Brucey. I think both your comments and Nisha's as well really set up what it is that the coalition would like to do and what we hope to achieve in this space. And I think to further entrench where our focus is, what we are also launching here today on the My Vote Counts website, where it will be live in a few moments, is firstly a sign-up form for anybody here or watching today who would like to be part of the coalition's efforts, activities, who would like to endorse the statement that Brucey just read out now, because that is also our statement of intent for what it is that we would like to do with this coalition, and you are more than welcome to do so. Secondly, we have also put up a survey, and this survey is called Attitudes on Party Funding. Now, as Busi read out, what is of paramount importance to us here is to create a kind of political culture where obviously we have transparency and accountability, but where we have a kind of space where we have our elected officials, our politicians working in the best interest of people, and where we have the public, where we have ordinary people able to have access to information where they can hold their politicians and elected officials to account, where they don't feel, as Nisha pointed out, that their vote, that their voice does not count. So with the survey, there are a few questions there where we are trying to understand, firstly, how do people think and feel, and how they would like to respond to the sort of crisis of party funding, what they want from their political parties. And this is used simply as an academic data gathering exercise, firstly, so that we're able to understand what the public is thinking and feeling on this, and which will secondly help us to build those kind of advocacy and awareness campaigns where we can really get to the heart of issues that people want to know about party funding. Obviously, in future, as both speakers have pointed out, where this work really lays is in ensuring that the PPFA as a piece of legislation does, and to our statement of intent, does what it says it's going to do. So we are expecting those first set of disclosures to be published by the IEC towards the end of September. And it would really be the work and the focus of the Coalition on Party Funding to look at what those disclosures actually are, who the funders are, what the amounts of those donations come out to make summaries, correlations, links between what those are, particularly for the public, and to have that information easily available and accessible to them, especially when they go to the polls to vote. As I say, both those links will be available on the My Vote Counts website, and that has been put in the chat box, our website, and you were able to access it there. I just want to say thank you once again to Nisha and to Busi for being here with us today. Unfortunately, Corruption Watch was unable to attend. They were also slated to speak today, but they also fully endorse the actions of the Coalition on Party Funding and the statement of intent. So I think there are a few questions that may have popped up in the chat box, which we'll have a look at now. And if there are any other questions that anybody would like to put to the speakers here today, you are more than welcome to do so. Okay, so in the chat box, we have a question which says, let me just make sure that I've gotten the correct name. The chairperson from the Dusi Association of Resident Ratepayers and Civics based in Pietermaritzburg, saying that Nisha had mentioned the capacity building of civil society organizations. Is it possible to do some training on the Political Party Funding Act and how to monitor the funding of political parties and any other training to assist such community organizations? Before I maybe hand over to Nisha, and if maybe he wants to make a few comments on that from his side, but I think that that is definitely one of the aims of the coalition, is to engage people from different community spaces, walks of life, that you are able to have access to information, first and foremost, about what the Political Party Funding Act is, what it sets out, what it's supposed to do. And then you in your communities are then able to take that information and hold your ward councillors, other elected officials to account if they are not delivering in the ways that they are supposed to. In future, some kind of training will probably be on the cards for the coalition. As of yet, that has not yet been concretized. But in the space of providing information, that is definitely something that the coalition would be interested in. Nisha, I'm not sure if there's anything else that you would like to add to that.
No, I think you've covered me. Thank you.
Okay, perfect. I think there may be another question in here. I'm just going to have a look. Okay, so There was a question in the chat box as well as to how organizations can join the coalition. So as I mentioned earlier, on the My Vote Counts website, you will see a link to a sign-up sheet. You can fill in your name, your email, what organization it is that you represent, if you are in fact representing an organization. And then there are just a set of questions there where you can tick the box or boxes that are appropriate to you. And those range from, would you like to endorse the statement? Would you like to be part of the activities of the coalition? Do you just want more information on this? There are a few selections to be made, and you can pick whichever one is appropriate for you, and then follow up communication will be sent out to you depending on your responses to that. Yeah, I think there may be a few other questions coming in from journalists. I'm just going to move over to my colleague Shaylin Clark, who is Communications Officer at My Vote Counts, who will just put out some of those questions. Shaylin?
Yes, so here is a question from Govan Whittles. He wants to know, what is the date for the disclosures to come in?
So the date that we expect that to come in is at the end of September, probably somewhere around the 30th. So once that is out, obviously, then we'll be able to make those connections that we spoke about earlier. Where we are at the moment is just in a bit of a wait and see, because we don't yet have that data available. But by the end of September, we should have that.
And then there's one more question as well by Govan. We understand that within the party liaison committee, there's much disagreement on whether or not the IEC has the power to raise funds, i.e. meet with investors and solicit donations for the multi-party fund. Does the coalition believe the IEC is allowed to do this or not? Is there any conflict?
The coalition has not yet taken a stance on that particular point. But what we have been doing, particularly in starting this coalition, is to continue to be engaging with the IEC as to how they see themselves fulfilling their mandate in regards to the PPFA. Because I think anybody who's familiar with the PPFA knows that there's quite a lot that the IEC needs to do. So on that front, we both want to engage and support the work that the IEC does. And if there are spaces where we need to discuss further, we think there may be opportunities, as I said earlier, for that kind of corruption or activity that we don't want to happen, we will continue engagement with the IEC. But on that point, not yet. There is another question from the chat box, and this asks if there is any resistance already from political parties. How do we ensure community activists are capacitated even to challenge this broken system on the ground? And then lastly to that question, will there be a pool of lawyers to litigate? I'm not sure if Busi or Nisha want to come in about how they feel about some of the resistance from political parties and how we can ensure community activists are capacitated to sort of fight back and make their voices heard.
No, thank you. Look, I think that there has obviously been indications of discomfort. I wouldn't say resistance, but at this point, discomfort. You've seen, I think, particularly the ANC Treasurer General talk about the effects that this legislation has already had on their ability, and I suppose for all other political parties it will apply. I think as a coalition, we need to monitor these kinds of discomfort or opposition to the legislation. We need to challenge the validity of some of them. And we need to force parties to make clearer their support for the legislation more than anything else. Where there are efforts to, where I think the real concern is that we will have to be looking out for is what I think is going to be indirect funding mechanisms. So money won't come to a party directly to, say, pay for T-shirts. It will go directly to a particular business to provide that kind of stuff, and probably won't even be recorded on their own books. That is what I think needs to be kept out. We need to be looking out for at a grassroots level, where we begin to pick up that kind of information that needs to be brought forward. And that you will find on social media, chat groups, and all of that. And I suppose that the level of the coalition and all of the kind of analytical work will have to begin to draw from those reports where we see these anomalies that are beginning to arise. So it does require a greater degree of vigilance at a grassroots level. Those who work within party structures but are opposed to or are in support of this legislation, I think have an incredible role to help make the legislation work by providing that kind of information as and when they come across it. Thanks.
And just to add, Robin, looking at what also Comrade Lamla raised about what's happening in the Eastern Cape, I think it will be important for the coalition in terms of making sure that we go around the country and having workshops so that activists can be empowered. Activists can know if they notice these kind of things, what action they can take. Thank you.
Yes, absolutely. I think Nisha and Pusi have already mentioned that. I think it's very important in the capacitating of community activists, is that really what the coalition is trying to do is not just the sort of analytical aspect there or highbrow engagement, but part of this work is to recognize that, as I said, party funding, those decisions have an impact on real people and real communities. And important to that work is to kind of be a channel or a funnel for the kind of things that are happening at that grassroots level, where that work can feed into the work that we are doing, and we can help amplify those voices and those spaces. And I think that brings to a fuller picture the kind of effect that unregulated party funding and the political decisions that come out of that can have for people. And I think just to the last point of that question, I'm just going to go back about will there be kind of a space to litigate? I think as the coalition moves forward and as we continue to implement certain strategies and activities, that could be an avenue that we may have to seek, is that given a particular problem as it relates to party funding or the PPFA, there may be a greater space to advocate for something, and that may include litigation. But that may come up as we continue the work of the coalition. I think there are a few more questions in the chat box. Let's have a look. Yeah, I think there are quite a lot of comments here about, as I've seen from a few people, that are asking that this is to ground it in a grassroots level. And I think that is absolutely correct. We are wanting to take on the concerns of people that are most affected by this, by no means implying what we think the situation is about, but instead to actually hear how this affects them, in what ways, and then create the appropriate responses for that. I think there was another question about where on the My Vote Counts website that this can be found. I will just ask Shayden if you can pop perhaps in the chat box a link directly to the page on the website where that is available. And then if you would like to do so, it will be in the chat box and you can follow that link. Okay, thanks. I see Shayden has made it available. So if anybody is still wondering about where they can sign up or join, that link is now in the chat box and you can do that. I think there was another comment here about perhaps wanting to do policy advocacy and litigation campaign, so that there would be sort of a logic of working across the spectrum of work. And I think that is perhaps a really good idea. I think that will help ground the work of the coalition. And we are always open to these kind of suggestions, particularly from communities that are feeling the brunt of these kind of political decisions and are representing particularly marginalized people. This is the kind of feedback that we would like to see. So thank you for all of you who have made your comments known in the chat box. We do appreciate that. Are there any other questions from the people here that you would like to know about this coalition? If you don't feel comfortable just asking the question, you're more than welcome to pop that in the chat box. Okay, there's been another great suggestion in the chat box as well about amplifying the voices from below in using a similar method that Right to Know has in its various campaigns. And I think what people are hitting the nail on the head in terms of our conversation with grassroots organizations is that we really do have to amplify these voices, which is partly why we have tried to partner with organizations specifically like Right to Know, who have done this kind of work, who have a vast amount of expertise in this space, and that will help to make our approach in this area far more well-rounded. But the work of the coalition only begins today. This is a long-term project that we will be engaged on. And we really urge you, because this is exceptionally important work, to fill in that sign-up sheet and whatever suggestions, feelings that you may have, to make that known so that we can take that on board. If there are no other questions at this time, then I think we can close that Q&A session, unless you want to leave last few comments in the chat box, and you are welcome to do so. Before we officially close this session, this launch of the coalition on party funding, I would just like to pass over to my colleagues Nisha and Busi for any final comments or feedback or suggestions that they would like to make. Busi, we can start with you.
Thank you, Robin. Something's wrong with my video. Well, I would think on my side, I'll just urge organizations to be part of this coalition because obviously we know that there is a greater need for this and it's all on us. We should make sure that we pressure political parties to take action, and we should continue to hold leaders accountable. Thank you.
Thanks, Robin. I think for me, what is important is the realization that politics matters, politics is important, not necessarily party politics only, but the importance of political parties and the role that they play in our society, I think has a new sense of urgency about us understanding their role, trying to find ways of managing that role, and particularly the more damaging aspects of that role, as we've seen in the last few weeks. But I think this campaign also needs to start talking to the funders themselves and business in particular. And we would need to talk to them about how they themselves are going to approach their support for this legislation. Because if we can get business and donors in general to begin to think about their support in a more positive way for this legislation, I think half the battle is done. The rest would actually then be the work that is envisaged here, the grassroots mobilization, the capacity building across society to understand the legislation, to monitor the implementation of this. And then obviously, lastly, is the partnership with the IEC. The IEC is critical for the success of this legislation. and we would need to support it and work with it and build its capacity to do this work as far as that is necessary and possible from civil society. So once again, thanks to you and thanks to everybody else for being here today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nishan, for your comments, Buse, as well. I think what we have laid out here today is that we are very much interested in creating a kind of democracy and representation that works in the best interests of everybody who live here in South Africa. And this work of party funding and making sure that the responsibility of politics and political decisions work in the interest of people. And the Coalition on Party Funding will become instrumental in ensuring that. So what we have started here today continues, as I said, in the long term. This is a project that we will continually be engaged in. We will continue to keep the public updated about what its activities are, its campaigns are, and how far we've come in realizing our goal of the transparent and accountable political space that we hope to create and the kind of political culture that we hope to engender. So thank you to Busi, to Nishan for being here with us today, for Corruption Watch in absentia, to everybody else who have endorsed the statement that Busi read out here today, and for the comments and suggestions that have come through and the questions. And again, I urge you to please have a look at the My Vote Counts website, where you are able to sign up or express interest or even just more information about the Coalition on Party Funding, and the survey which you can fill in as well. I see there's one more hand raised, so I will take that question.
Greetings everyone. I just wanted to know, is there any group where we can join, when we can actually be updated, and like if one is interested in joining the coalition, or should we just leave our numbers for the chat or what?
Absolutely. So as I said, if you look in the chat box, you will see a link. Alternatively, you can just go onto the My Vote Counts website and the sign up sheet where you can express your interest in joining the coalition. You can also indicate that you would like to receive communication from the coalition. So that will be updates about what the coalition activities are, depending on how you respond to that sign up sheet. You can say that you not only endorse, for example, the statement, but you also want to be involved in the activities. You want to be a member of this coalition. We will then follow up with you, given the email address and contact details that you leave on that sign-up sheet. So please have a good read through of that, so that we are able to know in what ways, if any, you would like to participate in the Coalition on Party Funding. Shaylin has left that link again in the chat box, so please have a look at that. And thank you once again for the active engagement, the very necessary engagement that we've had here today. And we look forward to all of you joining us as we continue this very important work. So thank you once again for taking the time out to be with us here today. And we look forward to sharing the continued work of the Coalition on Party Funding with you all. Thank you.